Thank you, Pietro, and good afternoon to you all. My name is Maurizio Brasini, and I'm really pleased. I know everyone says that, but I'm really pleased and happy to have the chance today to introduce this special event. I'm very pleased to introduce and present this event on behalf of the School of Cognitive. Uh, Cognitive Psychotherapy School, and on behalf of Professor Mancini, who really wanted to organize this event. And I have today a great chance that is to lay the ground for this summit on needs, goals, and motivations. So we are going to discuss one very important topic because as psychologists, we want to understand how human beings are made. And as a clinical psychologist, we really want to understand that also to help heal our clients. So I'm not going to argue on the topic at the moment because I just want to give you a very intuitive example of what I'm about to present you in this afternoon. Let's watch this video together first. What you have just seen is a famous video in the history of psychology dating back to the 40s. It was a study on apparent behavior. So, what you have just seen, as all of the people who have watched this video with simple geometrical figures moving around, is a big triangle and a small triangle together. And you probably had the impression that the big triangle was somehow bothering the small triangle. So if I asked you, to think of geometrical figures and to think that the geometrical figures might have intentions, you would say that that's not possible. But actually, we assign intentions to agents that move around. And this is exactly as when we look at the sunset and we see the sun that gently and softly is going into the sea, is sinking into the sea. But we know that the sun is millions miles away and it's the earth that's rotating. But what we do see is determined by the way we are built, we are made, in the way we perceive the world. Indeed, we know that as soon as we were born, before any experience, we have a preference for some patterns, for some simple shapes that have some common elements to a human face. So if we see a novel shape, that shape captures our attention. And why is it so? Because as species, we as humans, we belong to a group, to a society of human beings. So it is fundamental for us to recognize who is around us and their intentions. So there's a face, and maybe we can read from the face their intentions. That's the way we are made. This basic setting was called by Daniel Dennett the so-called intentional stance. So we attribute intentions to an agent, and we do the same to ourselves. So we get a first person stance as if we were an eye observing the world from a direction room. And among the other things we do, we perceive the external world and we feel what's happening inside us. We can feel this internal world. There is a special property about feelings, like the voice we can hear, but what we can feel can be felt and cannot be felt. We can ignore a voice, we can ignore a sound, or we can not understand that sound or that voice correctly. So this means that we are faced with things that we can feel and needs that we have, because needs are feelings. But we might have the impression of feeling that inside of us there are answers to our questions, but we cannot find them. There was a Italian comedian that was used to say the answers are inside of you, but they are wrong one. And then our body sends us messages, the guts convey messages, but we keep on eating junk food. And we often find ourselves faced with decisions we cannot make because, as Pascal was saying, the heart is saying motives and intentions that do not agree with the motives and intentions in our mind. So we are made of intentions. And the same applies with other people, because when we understand that people have their own mind and that we cannot have a direct access to other people's mind, because that's the theory of mind. We have a test that we administer to children when a child starts to understand that the parent cannot read their mind. So when we do discover that we understand that we need to guess what is happening in other people's minds. So reading the mind means reading the motives, the intentions, the hopes, the dreams, the desires of a person. And we will try to regulate the way others read our mind, what we want to hide, what we want to share. So needs also have another special feature. So we can feel our needs, people can infer our needs as well, but most of our needs are referred to others because we are a social species, and we sometimes expect that other people understand our needs and especially they meet our needs. But I do not want to delve into the topic too deeply. I just want to add one more thing. We said that needs are so important, so we would expect to know the needs very thoroughly. Instead, we have overlooked them. Historically, there has been a first stage that we could define is a taxonomic stage. So when we were trying to identify the instincts, so things that would not change, that would not vary, and that could help us orient and navigate the world. Needs at that time were multiplying endlessly. So at a given moment, after historical periods when needs were overlooked, people decided to start to have an approach that was focusing on understanding very few but fundamental needs. Very recently, an expert criticized this approach because he was stating a new theory and would say that if you adopt this approach, you are like a blind elephant in, and you can only touch a part of the element and you would infer a theory. But this is a partial theory because you can just consider a part of the elephant. And they are also biased theories because in the end you try to state a theory that goes to your benefit. Well, he was, of course, the one exception. But what we are faced with nowadays is a new research project focused on needs and based on the feature of needs being intuitive. And this project relies on developmental principles, meaning that they consider the evolution of the species. And we look for needs that have some features. So they contribute to well being and to the adjustment of people and adaptation of people. Needs are focused on primacy, so they are not to the service of other needs. And they have another feature, which is universality. It's used by Ekman as a word to say that emotions are those, regardless of the time. So, bearing this in mind, we are witnessing a spontaneous convergence of these approaches that look like each other. And under this framework, I'll tell you a short story. I was at a congress with Francesco Mancini, and Eshkol Rafaeli was also there. And he introduced for the first time Carol Dweck's model. It was probably 2017, and we were absolutely startled. I was mm, dealing with a project with Professor Liotti. So we were doing other things, but we agreed that we could not do without this new model. Why? Well, very simply explained, because then Carol will discuss this in her speech. She developed a model that is an antidote to blind elephants. She has taken into consideration a huge number of theories, from general psychology to clinical psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology. So, a huge and extensive analysis of very many theories that were considered by Pincus as blind elephants. And then she made a synthesis out of them. It's, I would define it as a genius, a synthesis. It's something that is absolutely very smart, very creative. I'm a clinician, and so I would start to uh, consider my clients in a different way, because I would think of them through Carol Dweck's theories and lens. So we thought of translating the theory. The copyright were purchased. This is an article that has been published in Italian, and with our contribution. A few years later, we were not yet satisfied, because we always look just at what we do, or just very next to what other people do. But we thought, why not inviting Carol Dweck? Let's try. So I wrote an email to Carol Dweck, and she replied to me in a short time, and she was really excited. And I also contacted Eshkol Rafaeli, and he also replied very quickly. So there was wonderful atmosphere of generosity, of excitement. So that was the story behind the decision to organize this event. So we are going to open up our summit with a keynote speech and by Carol Dweck, and then there will be three clinical dialogues to try to develop further and discuss further the idea that will be presented by Carol Dweck. We will take different perspectives. Chemotherapy with Eshkol Rafaeli, Barbara Basile, and Ela Refo. Then the perspective of compassion focused therapy with Niki Petrocchi and Simone Cheli, and then cognitive therapy, the perspective of cognitive therapy with Francesco Mancini and Amelia Gangemi. So I do not want to take more time, but before I would like to introduce you, Professor Dweck. Of course, she does not need any introduction. That goes without saying, because I'm assuming that you all know her research. She is the holder of the Lewis and Virginia Eaton Chair in Psychology at Stanford university. She's one of the leading scholars in the field of motivation, has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences, and has been invited to speak at the United Nations. She has received over a dozen of lifetime achievement awards for her research, which has had a far-reaching impact. Her work has inspired changes in education and organizations around the world, and her book Mindset has been widely acclaimed and translated into 45 languages. 15 languages, sorry about that. I do not want to take more time, so it's a great privilege that I'll give the floor to Professor Dweck.
Thank you, Maurizio. Grazie. I am absolutely delighted to be with you today. I am delighted that my theory resonated with all of you and stimulated your thinking. I was so excited to read your papers, and I'm excited to have the chance to learn from you today. How did my theory come to be? Like all graduate students of my generation, I secretly read and loved classic motivation-based theories of personality. But sadly, we were entering an era in which motivation, the basis of everything, fell out of favor. And at the same time, psychology departments were carving people up into segments, the cognitive segment in one area, the social part in another, the affective, emotional part somewhere else, and the developing part separate, with no motivational glue to hold it all together and to help us figure out how a person actually works. By the way, seen in this light, it makes Jeffrey Young's contribution all the more impressive. My theory was an attempt to take my unflagging commitment to motivation, to add what I had learned over the decades and put it all together. I asked, how do humans work? What do we come with? How do we build on that? What goes right and what can go wrong? I started with the basic observation that, and now I share my slides, the observation that babies are seeking, they're motivated creatures. They're seeking, they're motivated, but what are they seeking? They're seeking not just physical needs to fulfill not just physical needs, but also psychological needs. And importantly, they come prepared to fulfill them. Okay, whoops. Okay, here's my overview of early development. Children experience needs right from the start, helped by preparedness, that is, what they come with that makes them ready. They they pursue need-related goals. As they pursue these goals, they form mental representations, which I call beats, because they're beliefs, emotions, and action tendencies that we store. So they form mental representations of their experiences, and these beats guide future goal choice and goal pursuit. This is 100% a motivation-based theory. If motivation is defined, as it often is, as the forces that energize and direct behavior, then needs serve this energizing function, and goals and goal processes can serve the directive function, guiding the individual step by step toward need fulfillment. It took, what are these needs? It took a long process to identify them, and I describe that in the paper. But I just want to note now, many need-based theories began with adults. So we didn't see what was there at the start, and we didn't see how that was built on and how needs changed over development. I started with the criteria for a basic need. A basic need, the ones we come with, have universal high value. Well, all needs do. Um, from early on, babies frequently pursue goals that are relevant to that need. Second, meeting that need is a developmental necessity. Development goes awry if those needs are not met. And the basic need cannot be reduced to other needs. Let's start with the three basic needs that I identified: acceptance, predictability, and competence. And let's see how needs and preparedness, what we're born with, go hand in hand. That is, how infants come already prepared to start meeting these needs. First, the need for acceptance, which is the desire to engage in positive social interactions. Look how prepared we are. We're prepared from birth to attend to social stimuli, human voice, human face, especially the eyes. We're prepared to engage in reciprocal relationships very early on, a kind of back and forth with caregivers. Even at 2 to 3 weeks of age, babies get upset when a reciprocal interaction is disrupted. And over infancy, they remain attuned to synchronous or reciprocal relationships, even preferring films that show synchronous interactions versus not. The second need is the need for optimal predictability, the desire to know what goes with what follows what, how does this work? And the predictability preparedness is all kinds, contains all kinds of learning abilities. Um, Infants, a few days old, can learn conditioned responses and retain them. Newborns can do statistical learning. They hear a sequence of sounds, different sounds repeatedly, and they find a pattern. They see a sequence. They're shown a sequence of images repeatedly, and they find the pattern. I've seen these images. I've heard these sequences of sounds. They're really hard to parse. Infants can do it. There's early knowledge of probabilities, and there's heightened attention to cues about predictability, especially clues to causality. Third, the need for competence. This is the desire to develop skills that allow you to act in the world or on the world. Infants come prepared. They have a remarkable ability to identify optimal challenges, one that are just right for their current competencies, optimal things to look at that are just right for their current competencies. As you know, they're constantly practicing and stretching their skills. And even in early infancy, they're attuned to what we call pedagogical skills. When someone's about to teach you something, 2-day-old infants pay attention, close attention, to infant-directed speech that has that kind of, hi, baby, mother-ease tone. Remarkable. And if you doubt the importance of competence in the life of infants, I'm going to show you an image of a colleague's 5-month-old nephew who turned on the computer for the first time. There you go. Now, over time, needs can combine to create other needs, and I call these compound needs. Let's take a look. The compound needs require some cognitive development, the ability to form more complex schemas or to engage in more advanced metacognition, reflection on the self. The first compound need I want to talk about is trust, which is the combination of predictability and acceptance. Young infants, before the trust point, can recognize acceptance, they can track predictability, but they don't integrate them into a higher order schema, trust. Early on, any friendly person is fine, but later, toward the end of the first year, they're thinking, should I trust this person? And that means, is that person reading my cues and tuned into what I want? They become selective in who they trust. When you look at those orphanage studies, infants who were raised initially under dreadful conditions in orphanages, when does this have a lasting impact? In the first half of the first year, if they're adopted into homes, into families, they look over time exactly like kids who were born into those families. But by the second half of that year, you start seeing permanent deficiencies and failures, many, many failures to form secure attachment relationships with their adoptive parents. Next comes the compound need of control, the confluence of predictability and competence. And here, there's greater awareness of the self. This is the second year of life as a deliberate agent with its own plans and goals. So before that, they understand predictability, they have competencies, but now they become aware of themselves as an agent who can be a player in that world, use their competence to change or make the rules and not just follow them. And if this goes too far, online parents have 10 awesome tips for bossy toddlers. And the third compound need is self-esteem or status. And in comes a new ability, the ability to reflect on the self and compare yourself to a standard. Am I measuring up or not? So before then, infants can feel frustrated or unhappy when they fail or do something wrong. Now, later, they can reflect on the self when they do fail or do something wrong and feel bad about themselves, feel shame, guilt, label themselves as a bad child. Now, at the center of everything is what I call self-coherence. The need to feel that the self is intact and firmly rooted, rather than fragile, threatened, falling apart. And if you squint, you can see it here in the middle. I think of it as the hub of all the needs coming together. And I see it as I've proposed it's divided into two parts: identity, which answers the question, who am I? And includes things that define people and situate them, and meaning, which answers the question, how does or should the world work in ways that matter to me? Can I live a meaningful life in this world? Now, I didn't populate self-coherence with various needs, but if we look at some of the needs that have come up in recent papers, but Arndt's et al. Point to fairness. You can see how fairness could play a critical role in meaning. If the world is not fair, it's hard to think that it's working right and that your self-coherence will be solid. or the quest for significance in the paper by Rafua and Rafaeli. The quest for significance can be seen as the quest to find an identity that can help you find meaning and create meaning in your world. So, how does it all work? To review, children experience needs. We all experience needs. Help by preparedness. They pursue need-related goals. They form mental representations of their experiences, and these representations or beats guide future goal choice and goal pursuit. What's encoded in these beats? What did I do in my past, in the goal I just pursued, or in my past goals, if anything, or I could have observed things happening? What happened? I code what happened. How did it make me feel? How did I feel? I code that. What did it mean for how the world works or how I should behave in the future? Over time, these representations can become mental models, models of the self and world in relation to needs, a roadmap of the world, how it works, and how to function in it. Let's look at a few beats in action that we were able to kind of find in our work. And these are examples of how needs and beats affect behavior in the real world. The first study we'll briefly talk about is about attachment, which has been thought to be accompanied or underpinned by relationships of social contingencies. John Bowlby said, a child is busy constructing these working models of how, let's say, its caregiver may be expected to behave. And he thought they were important because they can serve as prototypes for subsequent relationships. Susan Johnson, Francis Chen, and I were the first developmental psychologists to demonstrate this directly in our work, showing these beats in action. The participants were 12 to 16-month-old infants. They were tested in a strange situation, Mary Ainsworth's situation, that you use to assess infants' attachment relationship with their caregiver. Can they use their caregiver as a secure base or not? A base from which to explore the world, a base that you can use to regulate your emotions. After going through the strange situation and being like put in an attachment category, secure, insecure, the infants went into an habituation paradigm, which I'll explain in a moment. It assessed their expectation of whether their caregiver a caregiver, a generic caregiver, would be responsive or not. Maurizio talked about how we attribute agency to symbols and shapes. Babies do that too. So we showed them over and over the top set. In it, a caregiver and a child are at the bottom step of this thing. The caregiver starts moving away, climbing up. The baby isn't able to do it and lets out a plaintive wail. They watch this until we say they habituate, it gets boring. And then we show them something new, a responsive event where the caregiver comes back down and to be with the baby, or an unresponsive one that continues going up the steps and is farther from the baby. What happens? The question is, what surprises the infant participant? Among those who had more secure attachments. The white bar, the unresponsive parent, was looked at more than their looking time at the last habituation trial. They recovered their interest, and we say they showed surprise. That is, the secure infants were surprised when the caregiver did not come back. In contrast, the insecure infants were more surprised when the caregiver did come back. It was marginally significant here and became significant in a larger sample. So we see these contingencies, these expectations come to life in this paradigm. There's also another big area of research in developmental psychology, helping or often called altruism. And the claim was it just was naturally there. But we thought, no, it's probably built, yes, on early sensitivity to reciprocity, but also beats, representations related to trust. So in this research with Rodolfo Cortez Barragan, we took 1-year-olds. Half of them had a brief period of reciprocal back and forth play with the experimenter. They rolled a ball back and forth, or they took turns pressing keys on a telephone. Telephones used to have keys. Um, the other half engaged in parallel play with the experimenter. They each had their own toys. They spoke back and forth in a friendly way, but they each had their own toys. And then the experimenter needed help in 4 different kinds of help, one after another. And the question is, did the infant help the experimenter? Mainly only after they played reciprocally. The back and forth, this responsiveness primed the help. When there was parallel play, so much for inborn altruism, it wasn't there. And the experimenter was really asking for help. We also asked, does a back and forth reciprocal relationship also apply to another person in the setting? Does it signal this is a place where people help each other? And we had 2 control conditions. One, the experimenter worked alone at a desk and said nice things to the child who was playing the parallel play again, and the reciprocal play. This time, there was a second person in the room that had not played with the child. But did the reciprocal play set up this idea? This is a place where people help each other. Yes. Children who played reciprocally with one adult helped the other adult in the situation. Is this a world where people help each other? We did a study with 2.5 to 3.5-year-olds in a local preschool. The mothers reported the typical frequency of their reciprocal play with the child, back and forth play, versus total play. And the preschool teachers rated children's helping or altruism in the classroom. This child is helpful, for example, an example item. This child is helpful and kind to others. Was there a relationship between the mother's reciprocal play at home and the child's altruism in school? Was the caregiver teaching, this is a world where people help each other? It turned out there was a noteworthy relationship between mother report of reciprocal play and teacher report of the child's helpfulness, in school. Total play that the caregiver reported did not predict the child's helpfulness. So far, I've highlighted needs and preparedness. I've suggested how together they can propel learning about the world, beats, and action in the world, goal pursuit. Where does personality come in, and how is it related to motivation? So in the model, motivation, the motivational processes go from the needs to the developed beats, which then guide goal pursuit to fulfilling the need, and to what I called online acts and experiences. Your acts and experiences in the real world. Online has really come to mean internet, but I mean in the world. Personality, I propose, consists of the characteristic and recurrent patterns of particular needs to beats to goal pursuits to acts and experiences in the real world. There can be a multiplicity of such patterns in any individual with differing frequency of them, differing strengths of them. I just want to, before ending, suggest briefly how needs and beats can go awry or run amok. Some needs may be so dominant as to drive out or thwart other needs. For example, obsessive compulsive behavior may represent such a strong need for control at a local level that it leaves little room for the flourishing of other needs. Key beats may be maladaptive. They may contain highly erroneous beliefs. They may encode extreme or inappropriate reactions. They may encode self-defeating action tendencies. There may be also a failure to update the beats in the face of counter evidence. But it may be threatening for someone, even with these beats gone awry, to give up those beats and need-related goals that, however costly, may have preserved for them their fragile self-coherence. Isn't that where therapy comes in? So now I turn it over to you, and I thank you all.
So thank you, Carol. Really, as usual, thank you so much. We will have time and space to be able to discuss about all the things that you suggested. But now we will keep with our program, and I will present the first of our dialogue. I want to present Professor Eshkol Rafaeli, Professor and Director of the Clinical Training of the Clinical Psychology Program at the Balhan University. He got his PhD at Northwestern University and completed the fellowship at the Harvard Medical School and the New York University. He was also assistant professor at Barnard College, Columbia University, and has published over 100 scientific articles and chapters, and is co-author of a book of schema therapy. His laboratory is dedicated to research on the intimate relationship and psychotherapy, and in particular on the personalization of treatments based on psychological needs and changes in schema modes within imagery-based CBT. His works have received funding from the NIMH, ISF, BSF, and Templeton Foundation, among others. And the dialogue will happen with Barbara Basile as well, psychologist, psychotherapist, trainer and supervisor in cognitive behavioral therapy and schema therapy. She holds a PhD in neuropsychology, has worked for many years in the field of human neuroscience. She's the author of numerous scientific publications and book chapters, and she studied the functional change involved in the cognitive elaboration and in many pathological conditions, obsessive compulsive disorder, hypertension, multiple sclerosis, dementia. And she wrote books and book chapters about many topics: neuroimaging, cognitive behavioral therapy. She's the director of the Italian Academy of Schema Therapy and a member of the International Society of Schema Therapy and the Italian Society of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy. And in addition, Ela Drefua is also contributing to the dialogue, is a PhD candidate at Bar-Ilan University, specializing in clinical psychology. His doctoral thesis empirically investigates various aspects of Carol Dweck's psychological needs model, exploring structure, dynamics in everyday life, and implications for clinical practice. So the floor to our discussant, who will have a dialogue about the topic.
Hello, thanks for this nice introduction. Maybe I will start, and afterwards I will give the floor to Eshkol and to Elad as well. First of all, of course, I would like to really thank Carol Dweck, because her work opened the minds of many of us who work in the clinical field dealing with psychopathology. And himself, as he was the one, Maurizio said it right, who actually introduced us to Carol Dweck work in 2019. And I will show you a picture about this, when we were having our conference in Assisi for our postgraduate students, and had a keynote lecture, and he introduced us for the first time to Carol Dweck work. So I think somehow he started pioneering what Carol Dweck was writing and saying and finding in her studies, trying to start an integration with the model of needs proposed by Jeffrey Young. So what I would like to do now is just to give a very brief introduction on the specific role of needs in the schema therapy framework. Within this model, the fulfillment of emotional core needs is essential for individuals' psychological well-being. And from their birth and during all their development, children present some universal innate emotional needs, including, for instance, the need for connection, trust, safety, the need for autonomy, the need for realistic limits, freedom to express such feelings and needs, and finally, the need for playfulness and spontaneity. And especially in the first years of our lives, these needs need to be met by caregivers or significant others. And according to the schema therapy model, when those needs are unmet, are frustrated, early maladaptive schemas might develop, which in turn might contribute to later psychopathology. And accordingly, the major aim of the schema therapist in his clinical setting is to help the client to identify their early unmet emotional core needs and to help the client to meet these needs. So within the psychotherapy itself, this can be done in several ways. One way, for instance, could be within the therapy room in the present moment, which means that the therapist acts as a partial good parent using the so-called limited reparenting technique, which means meeting those specific unmet emotional core needs within and through the relationship with that specific patient. So, for instance, when we're working with a person where the need for predictability has not been met in childhood, the schema therapist will be particularly careful in explaining and anticipating every single step of the therapy in order to allow the client to experience and feel what meeting this need of predictability means in his or her own experience. Also, another way the schema therapist can do to deal. So I was talking about limited reparenting, where within the context, the patient has the possibility to experience what having the feeling of meeting an unmet emotional core needs does mean. And also, second, the schema therapist can deal with such frustrated emotional core needs, might be using emotional experiential techniques, such as, for instance, imagery exercises, chair work, or historical role play, where the vulnerable child, which is the part of the patient that is suffering from the unfulfillment of those emotional needs, finally experiences the positive feelings associated with the fulfillment of those emotional needs who are met through these exercises. But as well, another way we can help the client in the first stages of therapy is to just give him or her some education about needs in a very general way and about the role of these needs in healthy growth. So this means that the client can feel that he's not criticized or judged. This is because in many cases, patients come to therapy having the belief that they are greedy. So it might be very important from very early stages to know and to hear from the therapist that these needs are just human, innate, and so this allows these needs to be validated and normalized. And in a more practical way, just to give you a very short example, education about emotional needs might mean, for instance, starting to conceptualize the patient's mode formulation, where their unmet core need can be conceptualized into the vulnerable child mode, dealing with delineating how specific coping mechanisms such as freeze or flight or fight might have served as survivor mechanisms, survivor strategies in the past, allowing the child to survive in those specific circumstances where those specific early needs were not met, and so on, in order to delineate the role of what has been called within the schema therapy framework the healthy adult mode, which will be potentiated during therapy in order to allow the person to identify, to validate, and then meet their needs in a more adaptive way. So, after this brief introduction on the role of emotional needs in the context of schema therapy, as I said, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues who will share with us a recent clinical application of this need-focused approach. So, Eshkol or Elad, I don't know who of you will start us first, but I will stop sharing my slides and
So I think I'll start, and Ed, you'll join in when you start hearing me say incorrect things. That's usually the role that Ed plays in my life, is he keeps me honest in what we're doing and in how we're trying to pursue this work. I'll start with thanks though, because this is such a wonderful opportunity for us, first of all, to meet all of you. Some of you have had a chance to meet before, maybe people in the audience too. We've read your article. We've had you visit us virtually through Zoom in in a lab meeting and in dissertation proposal meetings, but I've never heard you speak about this article. I've read it, so to hear you actually present it was just such a treat to hear these specific things you say that I would think I sometimes skip the developmental parts, which are, for example, a lot less my area of expertise. I'll say that I love, Barbara, that you put up that picture from Assisi in 2019, both because it was really fun to be in Assisi and visit you all there, but also because it puts a timestamp on how early, and I think it was about a year earlier, sometime in 2018, that I stumbled on the psych review paper that is at the center of this summit today, and the center of my thinking pretty much on a daily basis ever since then. So, Carol, you've had, at least on my life, a huge impact. There is barely a day that goes by where I don't somehow think about that paper or talk to people about it. And
I
I
can
did
speak to that. I can speak. I see that from close by, actually. Every day we are talking about your book.
exactly. So I'll say that the impact to me was in reading a paper that made perfect sense to me as a schema therapist. So the way Barbara presented, so the basic logic of schema therapy is really a logic of going from needs to goals to representations. I mean, that is exactly the logic that schema therapy, the way that Jeff Young and others have formulated it in the past 35 years or so, um, works. But the beauty of suddenly reading it in the words and in with the research references of so much developmental research, so much social research, so much personality research, and not just this thing that is clinical speculations that we as clinicians sometimes feel are just not as strong. So seeing real research supporting this kind of logic was wonderful. And within that paper, I think the part that has been most central in my thinking has been the needs model. And so I'll show in a second a couple of slides that show how we draw the exact same model that Carol showed a minute ago that moves from basic needs to compound needs all the way to self-coherence. But then I'll talk about what what I think interests most of the audience today, who are clinicians, I understand, which is how do we translate this into clinical thinking, and where do we find this to be useful? So I have a few slides and I'll jump between them in a way that's not very organized. It's not a talk, it's more things that I prepared just to make sure that we are all on the same page. And before I actually not before, I'm going to do it right now. Let me share my screen. I wanted to start with the way that we draw. And wait, can you see the transcript of the session at the bottom of my screen? So maybe I can move it out so it doesn't interfere.
I
So
don't.
you don't, good. All right. So can
Okay.
you see the word acceptance on the screen?
Yes. Yes.
Great. We're on the same page. So before I go through the way that we sort of, for practical reasons, have redrawn the model, but trying to maintain the ideas that Carol, that you had in the psych review paper, I'll say that the reason this part was so influential for me is that as a schema therapist, I always felt like there's such a clear, nice logic in the way that Jeff Young and others have spelled out the way schemas are formed and the way coping responses and ultimately modes play out. But the part that always felt a little bit speculative to me was the needs model at the basis of schema therapy. The way it was formulated early on in the approach, and I think in many ways is still being taught when we stick with the canonical books by Jeff, and I co-wrote a book with him, so I can say that I'm responsible or guilty for this myself, is a set of needs that were thought to represent the existing schemas. And so there was a back and forth between identifying schemas or beats in Carol's language. And then taking a step back and saying, well, where would these schemas emerge from? And that process was mostly not very empirical, I'll say. It was very clinical. Had a chance as somebody who got into schema therapy relatively early in around 2001. I got a chance to be there for some of the late discussions before the most comprehensive book on schema therapy came out in 2003. We would have these Friday meetings at the Cognitive Therapy Center or Schema Therapy Center of New York, and they were really anecdotal. There would be examples of schemas from patients, patients that Jeff Young himself saw, or patients that other people in the center saw. And then we would try to step back and say, well, what is the need underneath that? And that ultimately led Jeff to create a taxonomy of 5 needs. And as a schema therapist, I always felt like I'm not sure. I'm not sure that covers it. Reading the psych review paper by Carol made me feel like, okay, here's a model that, as you said, Carol, might not be done. There might be needs to, you might need to populate the self-coherence needs some more. There might be ways to tweak some things. But here's an attempt to really review an empirical literature on needs and motivation that goes back a century and fit things fit things developmentally and come up with this model that sees these 3 basic needs for acceptance and competence. And I always present them in this order, by the way, because I think that any clinician who's familiar with attachment theory would certainly have no problem identifying the basic need for acceptance and belonging, whether in the infant form or in the form that it takes later on in life, as well as the need for competence. It sort of maps onto Bowlby's ideas of a secure base and a safe haven in attachment, so those 2 parts. But the 3rd basic need in the model is already, and I think Barbara would want to talk about it again too, as we'll add in a minute. The 3rd basic need was like fireworks exploding in my head when I started reading about it. And I don't know if you know how impactful it is for you to talk about optimal predictability to clinicians. That there are major problems with the way the field of psychology as a whole and the field of clinical psychology specifically has neglected the world of motivation for way too long in mid-century to late century, 20th century, and it's coming back slowly. But this particular need, the need for predictability, is one that even after, attachment theory started affecting all of us, and we could talk about acceptance and talk about competence, and remember that Freud talked about love and work as basic needs that everybody has. Predictability was always there but disregarded, there but taken for granted, and putting it as a basic need, putting it as a foundational in the foundational tier of needs for which babies are prepared, come into the world prepared, I think is remarkable. And we'll talk about that in the dialogue between us in a second. But I'll say that that already, just that makes, and I'm saying this to everybody in the audience, go read the article and you'll see why predictability is a big deal for us to be talking about. But then on top of these basic needs,
And can I add a small thing, Eshkol?
please.
I think the exciting thing about predictability, and I share the enthusiasm about this added need, is the optimal predictability. Is being not just you must have the world as predictable as possible, but looking at it as an optimal need where you have like a center or a sweet spot where predictability is satisfied, and maybe too much predictability is also not so good for you, because then you don't have curiosity and you don't feel open to the world. So that's, I think, part of a really, like, for me as a young clinician, I see it like as like in therapy as I learn. It's like it's really there.
And it was absent from schema therapy, and I think most other approaches as well. If it's there, it's thought of as the need for safety, but that's not exactly it. It's not just safety. This is an epistemic need. It's a need um, for knowledge and understanding and curiosity, and but at the same time stability. So that already went beyond what we were talking about in schema therapy and many other approaches. In the second tier, and we draw it a little bit differently, Carol, than you do, but I think it's the basic idea. We think of how compound needs are stacked on top of these basic needs. So the need for trust is something that requires additional cognitive capabilities, but relies on the infrastructure of having some acceptance and some predictability, or sufficient acceptance, sufficient predictability. Similarly, the need for what you call control, which we often call autonomy when we talk about it, because we think it's very similar to what self-determination theory discusses when they talk about autonomy. But control as the compound need that includes competence and predictability, and self-esteem and status as the compound need that includes acceptance and competence. And finally, we think of it as sort of the pinnacle or the top of this structure, these needs for self-coherence, meaning, identity, maybe justice, like you mentioned, maybe significance. That's another point of conversation that when we prepared for today, Barbara and Elad and I thought we might want to hit in our conversation, like where would we fit those needs in this? So I'll say that this is how, after reading your article and getting excited about it and starting to talk about it pretty much on a daily basis with students and others, I asked one of my talented students to make this drawing so that I could present it in a gradual way this way. And then this wonderful opportunity came about, and I'll tell you briefly about it, and then we'll switch to discussion mode. But the wonderful opportunity was the opportunity to start thinking about treatment personalization through a collaborative project that a former student of mine, Dr. Gal Lazarus, who's now a professor at the Hebrew University, initiated. Gal was just finishing his PhD with me and going to the University of California at Berkeley to work with a psychotherapy researcher there named Aaron Fisher. Aaron is a CBT therapist and a CBT researcher and had done work on treatment personalization, mostly looking at David Barlow's unified protocol, which is made up of separate modules that are all very effective across, it's transdiagnostic, so they're very effective across anxiety, depression, and other domains. But most of those modules basically address variations of emotion regulation, which is really important. They don't go beyond that. And when God initiated the idea of us submitting a grant together, Aaron, myself, and him, he said, how about we work on treatment personalization? But you keep talking in your schema therapy world, you keep talking about these needs. How about we do the personalization based on needs? And at first, I was a little reluctant, but thankfully, he convinced me. And the past 5 or 6 years, I've really been devoted in my lab to this kind of work. What we ended up doing is developing a sequence, and I'm going to switch to the slide quickly, a sequence of interventions where we told ourselves, assuming that we have a limited length of time with a patient, which I think is a fair assumption in our present day clinical world, especially in public mental health, where resources are very scarce. This started around the beginning of COVID, but other world events have happened since, and they've made health system, and this is true in the States, it's true in Israel, I'm sure it's true in Italy as well, and other countries, made the need to have brief, often focused, and personalized interventions very prominent. And so our thinking was, how about we limit it down to a very short time, 90 minutes or 100 minutes. We're calling it single session, but it's really not a single session. We spread them out over a longer in-person meeting and a shorter check-in afterwards. And in that short period of time of 90 to 100 minutes, or single session if you must, what would happen if we knew that the person coming in is somebody whose schemas are indicative of an unmet or a thwarted need for predictability or for acceptance or for competence? And I'll show you additional needs in a second, but what would be what we would want to do with them? So first of all, there's the mapping of needs to schemas, which has always been there in schema therapy, but we're trying to expand it using this expanded model of 7 or 8 needs, depending on how you count self-coherence, depending on whether you divide it into identity and meaning. Sometimes we even think of a ninth need. So first of all, what do we know about patients who are particularly frustrated in their need for predictability or in their need for competence or in the need for acceptance? And then secondly, what does the evidence-based literature on psychotherapy tell us about possible first-line interventions? And when I say first-line interventions, I'm saying that we need to be very, very humble in what we think we'll accomplish if we have such short time, if we really are working with somebody just for 90 minutes or 100 minutes. But these would also be the first line interventions we would use within longer term therapy when we know that this is a chapter of time or a series of sessions that aren't necessarily limited to just one or two, where we can focus on this particular need, where this need becomes more prominent. And so we spent about a year just scouring the literature for whatever approaches we could find that would be A, evidence-based, B, have some suggestions for brief interventions, and C would fit in this model. And it ended up being actually relatively easy to find things. So for predictability, we found a lot of inspiration in the work, on the one hand, of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, the other hand, in the work on mindfulness-based stress reduction, ideas from John Kabat-Zinn and others, and specifically some work by a pair of researchers from the States named Doug Menin, who's now at Columbia, and David Fresco at Kent State, who created a version of ACT called emotion regulation therapy. We thought it's perfect, and we used ideas from that. But for thwarted acceptance or belonging, we thought that the best evidence comes from interpersonal therapy. And for thwarted competence, we thought the best evidence comes from behavioral therapy. And I'm saying all these things because I think that um, anybody in the audience who happens to be a schema therapist knows that schema therapy all along is very willing, very easily borrows from a variety of approaches as long as it fits a basic theoretical model. We have no problem adopting ideas from ACT, behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, and I'll have some examples of other approaches here in a second, as long as we can fit it within this theoretical model that goes from needs to goals to representations. So that first slide was the three basic needs. The second slide has the compound needs that Carol talked about: trust, control, or what we call autonomy, self-esteem and status, and self-coherence. And we also add a need that I hope we get back to in the discussion afterwards, which isn't, Carol, in your model, but we couldn't give it up. It's a need that matters to us too much clinically, and it's the need for spontaneity and play. And I know Barbara wanted to talk about it, and Maurizio loves this need as well. And
Yes.
hopefully in the discussion later on, we'll get back to it. And for each one of these needs, again, we have some idea of what characterizes people for whom this is the most pressing, most unfulfilled or unsatisfied need. And we can think of first-line interventions, but I'll say that as we were building our model of these single session or brief interventions, we could identify, for example, what we would want to do with trust and immediately decide that that's not something we would want to do in a very brief format. Trust, for exactly the reasons that you illustrated in those developmental studies, trust is something that involves ongoing reciprocity and ongoing relationship. And here we have an intervention that's based on a, basically a one-time encounter plus a check-in a couple weeks later. So we thought of ideas from imagery work, which are actually the most schema therapeutic of everything you'll see in the slide, but then decided to not build a single session intervention for trust, but we did build one for autonomy based on decisional balance chair work and on some older interesting work on motivation, intrinsic motivation and assertiveness. We could think of things that work on self-esteem and status that come from self-compassion, and I know we have self-compassion therapists here today. So we were inspired by self-compassion therapy, both in the Kristen Neff version and in the Gilbert version, but also ideas from emotion-focused therapy. We could think of ideas to work on self-coherence, particularly on meaning, but also on identity. And this brought us back to the commitment part of acceptance and commitment therapy, and ended up not doing this mostly because we had too many needs to work on. And we couldn't give up the need for spontaneity and play, so we kept that in there, and thought that the best ideas for that come from positive psychology, but also from that aspect of behavioral therapy that works on pleasant activity scheduling. Barbara, I promise to be brief and get back to the discussion in a second, but I'll say that after spending about a year thinking how should we build these protocols, we ended up building a project in which uh, yep, in which we created 6, we call them modules. Basically, they're standalone interventions Each row is a separate intervention. So if somebody is randomized to receive the predictability module, they'll be going through the sequence of things that are written here. If somebody is randomized to receive the autonomy or control module, they'll go through this sequence of things. For some reason, not all of the six are showing up on my screen. I wonder why that is. It's like the slide is too big. But in addition to the single session version of the study, which is running, we've run close to 100 patients, no, more actually, between us and Berkeley, more than 100 patients by now in this, and we have some nice results from it. We also started thinking how to use the same ideas in a group therapy format. This happened because of all sorts of emergency responses that we had to do through our research clinic at our university. And we initiated a group project, and I'll take off the slides in a second after I show you the group project. But the basic idea was anything that we're doing here on a one-on-one basis in this research study, where we bring people into the lab and record them and actually also measure their physiology and the therapist's physiology and have three cameras and three microphones and so on. Anything we do in this kind of format might actually work quite well also online, not one-on-one, in group format, and not as a single session, but instead as a sequence of four groups. And what we did is we thought which of these six needs, I don't know why it's not showing it neatly. I'm gonna take off the, yeah, show it this way, maybe it'll be easier.
Maybe if you
Which
take
of the, yeah,
no,
so
sorry,
which of
go
the
ahead.
six needs, you can still see the slide, right?
Now it's
Yeah,
much
I'm
better.
sorry.
We can see them all.
Good. So it was cutting off the last one, but which of these six needs would we want to do in a group format? And we decided that the easiest one to implement in a group format would be the ones related to predictability, belonging and connection and competence, pretty much as is, as we were doing one-on-one, and also playfulness, which again, we just can't give up. So basically the two that we I've taken out of the group format are the ones involved in self-esteem, which I think is a more private experience that should be explored one-on-one rather than in a group, as well as autonomy, just because autonomy is, I think, a more complicated module for us to do when we do it one-on-one, and it involves this really interesting work on decisional balance that we learned, again, from other schema therapists, but also from Matthew Pugh, who I saw today is going to be at an event that um, is going to be in Italy in January. So I highly recommend his work on decisional balance and other forms of chair work. So this is a sort of background for what we're doing that tries to apply this. I'll switch to one last slide that has links that might be useful for people, and leave it on just for a second because there are QR codes. Folks are welcome to just copy. But to take you to two different things that we find useful. One is a measure, and Elad will be better than me at talking about this measure. A measure that in a lot of consultation with Carol, and as part of Elad's dissertation, we've created for the sake of trying to assess in a really quick and dirty way, meaning even in daily diaries, so in measures that are administered repeatedly, the level of need satisfaction and need frustration of all these needs that I just went through, including all the ones that are in Carol's model, including meaning and identity as two separate needs, but also playfulness, because again, we can't get rid of it. So that's the barcode or the QR code on the right. And the QR code on the left has just all the materials for these six single session modules that are the basis for the group and mostly the basis for the individual work that we're doing, that we're happy to have people play around with and use. We do have some early evidence showing that even this very brief intervention, when it helps patients and therapists create a language of speaking about needs, which I think is the thing we're most grateful for in adopting this way of thinking, adopt a language of needs, and then be able to focus for this limited time of 90 minutes, 100 minutes on one of these needs leads to a reduction in frustration across the board, a significant reduction in 5 out of the 9 needs. We're still tweaking to see what it is that's going to make the reduction significant across the board, but it's in all needs that we see a reduction in frustration um, as we use this intervention. So I'll stop with the slides, but say that when we had a preparatory conversation about this, Barbara and Elad and I, we thought that it would be nice to talk about this group intervention and the way it goes from predictability through relatedness or connection and competence, all the way to playfulness as a framework for us to organize our discussion and specifically to think about what does it mean to reintroduce a language of needs, a language of motivation back into clinical practice, which I think surprisingly just really was absent for a very long time, even in approaches that I think many of us here were trained in and feel very comfortable with, like cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal therapy, where where these things were essentially neglected. I think for the same reasons, Carol, that they were neglected in academic psychology, which is that behaviorism didn't allow there to be a discussion of these, hidden concepts like motivations or needs. So, Barbara, tell me if you want to spend some time talking about predictability some more. Elad, maybe you have some things to add to what I described.
I have one thing that I think is important. If we're talking after Carol's great talk, which talked about development, and now
Do something with the microphone so we can hear you better. Now I can't hear you at all.
Now is it better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm thinking two things about the talk. First, Carol's manuscript is talking mainly about development. And one of the things we wanted to do when thinking about this model is trying to think about how an adult going through in the world, how he handles and how his needs or their needs are handled in the daily lives. So we used, I think, a lot of self-determination theory thinking using their motivational framework to see how they address needs in daily life with adults. And there, I think one important aspect we have found, which helps me really think about needs, is thinking about needs in two separate aspects. One is frustration, as one is satisfaction. There is a difference if you talk about need as satisfying them. I want to be more related to people. I want to feel more competent. Or someone who comes to therapy whose needs are frustrated, actively frustrated. Think about someone who's not just unrelated to people. People are really against him. He's getting pushed away by them. It's clinically, I think for sure, we can see those are two different aspects of a certain need. And I will share that this is an argue me and Eshkol has for the last few weeks, since in self-determination theory, they really talk about it as two distinct needs. One is a deficit need, and one is really a growth need. The frustration is a deficit need, and I see it as a very important aspect when you look at needs in a clinical way, since I think in our and in the questionnaire the Eshkol showed, we have two items for each need. One is a satisfaction item and one is a frustration item. And in our study, we chose to take the frustration items since we see it as we see it, and I'll be happy to hear your thoughts, and disagreements I think are good. That first when client comes to therapy, he's talking about how their needs are frustrated. You have some in clinical aspect when you talk about fulfilling your needs and becoming and getting better in those needs. And I think the place where this question arises even more is in the need for self-coherence. Is it only a need of when needs are met and satisfied, or can we have it also frustrated, and how? I think it's really, for me, those are really interesting questions.
Thank you, Elad. Indeed, I think this is also what maybe Carol Dweck was talking about when she was talking about an optimal level of predictability. Because again, I'm thinking about very anxious parents, or parents that are really fearful about everything and that don't allow their kids to discover the world, to go around even just like in very close and safe places. So on the same way, I think there needs to be a kind of optimal level of predictability where if it's too much or it's too less, of course, in both these extreme cases, it might be dysfunctional. So I think this ranging from +100 to -100 when we're talking like about satisfaction and frustration are definitely very important, considering the graduation of needs. Also, what happens sometimes, and I'm mainly thinking about traumatic events with clients within our clinical practice, we have one single super traumatic event where there is no graduality, but it's all done in 1 second, 1 minute, or in a very short period of time. So again, this is another possibility where we can like somehow we're confronted and we have to deal with the frustration of this specific need of predictability. So loads of differences scenario can happen.
Maybe I'll say a word about trauma. I had a conversation with a trauma researcher yesterday, where we were trying to think about how traumatic events are both, a horrible and tragic frustration of the need for predictability, but they're often also the absence of satisfaction of other needs, the absence of satisfaction. I think for many people who go through trauma and experience moral injury, the experience of not, the shattered assumptions about the social world, or the assumption that they are competent, or is both of those things. It's both a frustration and a lack of a satisfaction of a need, and those two components might play out differently in how hard it is to recover from the trauma. Maybe we'll say, Barbara, I wonder whether you agree with this feeling that I described earlier of how, in going through Carol's model and talking about acceptance and belonging, talking about competence, those are territories that are familiar to clinicians, I think, from most orientations. But the notion of predictability, which I described as setting off fireworks in my head, I think was always sort of obscured in our thinking, even as schema therapists, where the role of all schemas in general is to create a sense of predictability in the world, right? The beats or representations that we have are there to make the world, understandable, even if it's understandable in a negative way, but at least understandable. But to pull it aside and say, here's a need in its own right, and we can start tracking it the moment an infant is born, and it's there. And maybe there are schemas that are unique to it, that are specific to that. I wonder if you had the same reaction, both in terms of reading this theoretically, but also in a clinic when you think this with patients or with supervisees.
Yes, I was thinking an extra thing as well, looking like in those last days, in order to get myself prepared for this meeting, I found a paper that has just been published where the authors, which are actually some Belgian authors, are trying to validate a questionnaire which is aimed at investigate the need for controllability and predictability. And which happens quite often, they put these two concepts together. But in my view, they're not exactly the same when I'm thinking about my clinical practice, because you can somehow understand or predict something, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it's related to a coping control mechanism. So this is another thing that somehow made me think about definitions, about the words we use. And so going back to what you were saying earlier, indeed, I think this need for predictability was so implicitly everywhere, but no one really made it explicit. And maybe in our clinical practice, we do that dealing with the single story of our clients. So we talk about predictability, but in a very individual way, adapting it to the specific context or story or childhood of our patients. Maybe, yes, we miss, or to put it like, in a broader, as I said, a more explicit way. And so, yeah, I thought it was funny. I found this article about this questionnaire because they were really trying to investigate this need, but putting it together with the need for controllability. And, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry. We have only 10 minutes left for this dialogue, if it's okay for you. It's okay?
Okay.
It helps our predictability.
Exactly.
Exactly. If it's fine for you, I also wanted to add something more about the other needs Eshkol mentioned earlier, which I know Maurizio is also like very fond of, which is the need for playfulness. And I would just like to give a very brief introduction. I'm sorry, but I want like things to be as clear as possible for those of you who don't know schema therapy. But within the schema therapy framework, this is again universal and innate needs, which is mainly being coupled with the need for spontaneity. So they all go together. And within case formulation in terms of modes, we call it the happy child mode. And within the schema therapy model, it has been suggested that the frustration of these needs in childhood might lead to development of early negative, of course, so maladaptive schemas, which are related to rigidity, unrelenting standards, emotional inhibition, criticism or punitiveness, and overall harsh pessimism. And in line with this view, within the clinical practice, we can observe that patients with cluster C personality disorder usually display the frustration of this specific needs in early years. So, for instance, a future patient with avoidant personality disorder has been inhibited in his play in order to avoid getting criticism. Or, for instance, as we were talking before about predictability as well, patients with future dependent personality characteristics might have been inhibited or scared by their caregivers when they wanted to explore the world, dealing with curiosity and thus playing somehow. And a similar thing was also related, of course, to a lack of autonomy, as playing somehow also goes in this direction. And as well, inhibition and frustration of the need to play has been observed in clients with obsessive compulsive disorder, personality disorder, where the inhibition of play might have contributed to extreme rigidity and perfectionistic standards these patients usually display. And another thing I wanted to say, which I think is quite relevant for our discussion, is the distinction that has been made between play in terms of an act and play in terms of playfulness, which, for instance, Nina Lieberman stated as an individual predisposition that predisposes to engage in play and can be more defined as a trait of personality. So play has been a lot investigated, especially in early ages. However, paradoxically, despite in the last years, many studies showed that playing as an adult has a very positive impact on stress, mental health, and so on. play is still considered in antithesis of work, especially within our culture, which is based on productivity and higher cultural goals. So I think this is another thing that usually we try to teach to our clients when within our clinical experience, we notice that they don't know anything about playing, relaxing, having funny moments, and so on. So, well, within clinical practice, I think again that this is important to address. I think Carol maybe wants to say something.
I just want to try something out. I'm thinking that play in childhood is a way that babies, children explore their world to try out roles and types of action in a hypothetical way. And I'm wondering if we could, and play is a way that infants and children build their competence by trying out things, testing out things. Play is different from competence. I recognize that, but just again, taking this developmental stance of it being a way of building a fun, experimental way of building competence early. Similarly, it could be in adults, ways of trying out, joking, testing the waters. I'm just putting that out there for.
Eshkol, you
And
wanted to
maybe
say
also
something?
serving and maybe it could also be thought of as serving as the sandbox in which autonomy gets created, right? So it's the place where I do things, and that then leads to identity as well. I I think it's there, and actually this in some ways touches on a question that Barbara and Elad and I had when we prepared for this, which is as clinicians, one of the benefits that we get from speaking about needs and speaking about them explicitly is this idea of universality and the ability to psychoeducate patients and make them feel, as I think we all want to, that it's healthy to have these needs and that these needs are there for a reason. But then there's the question of exactness and whether these needs or another need that we talked about as one that has been proposed, and we're wondering whether it's necessary in its own right or not, is the need for justice or the need for fairness. We we thought about that because we have a colleague in the schema therapy world who very much advocates for talking about that as its own need, that with its own associated schemas, if it's frustrated, and we're trying to play around with the idea of whether we see it as a separate need or as something that is subsumed within existing needs, and does it matter for us as clinicians? As a schema therapist, one of the nice things I think that Jeffrey Young encouraged us to do from a very early stage was to not stick to any kind of fixed language of schemas or needs or modes, but to tailor things to patients in whatever way works for them. So we're free to do whatever we want and name needs whatever way we want. We're not researchers when we're in the clinic, but when we're clinical researchers who want to bring this knowledge base into the clinic, will it matter if we identify, justice or identify, Carol, you mentioned the work on the need for significance, that Arya Kuglansky talks about now. So talking about that as its own separate need with its own associated schemas or not, I think that the jury is still out on these things.
I could see justice and as a form of a basis for trust, fairness as a matter of trust. I could see it. I know in the Arndt's paper, they wanted to distinguish it. I could see it going that way, or I could see it as embedded within identity and particularly meaning. How does the world work in a way that I can have meaning for me in a way that I can trust. So
you know, and also
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Elad, please.
I think justice also helps us make the world predictable. And we can,
yeah, sorry, go, Elad.
No, go.
No, I was just thinking at the beginning, also talking the other day with Eshkol and Elad, like I was really very convinced that we were talking about an emotional need. But the more and more I think about, especially linking it to my clinical practice and to some two broad categories of clients I have in mind, I just think it's less an emotional need, but it's more an assumption or a belief we have about how the world should be in terms of being a fair place or an equal place. But this is very unrealistic. I mean, I think if everyone has this need, it has to be frustrated because the world isn't like this. So I think actually having this assumption, this expectation about the world somehow might contribute within clinical practice to anger responses, or for instance to what some patients claim in order, for instance, to feel entitled to be compensated for unfair situations they underwent, or for instance for abusive situations or whatever. So it's more something that our clients can use in terms of belief they have about how they think the world should be or others should treat them. But at the same time, it changes its motivation aspect. So I don't know if I made myself clear, but I think it's less related to an emotional need, but more to the way we expect things to be, which is again related, as Elad said, to predictability, I know. But this means it shouldn't be a universal and primary emotional need, as we stated at the beginning when we were talking about emotional needs.
I want to contribute to the discussion because the hope for this summit was that it could become an open dialogue. And even though we get out of the separated space of our different disciplines, it would be very useful. But I think it would be very interesting to continue later with the discussion. One of the topics that seems spontaneously emerging from your dialogue will be resumed by Francesco Mancini and Amelia later, so that we can reflect again on this.
So I would like to start this second dialogue by setting the framework. It's going to be the CFT framework, compassion focused therapy. So there's with us Niki Petrocchi, clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, and associate professor of psychology at Gian Capo University in Rome, founder and director of Compassionate Mind Italy, and an international renowned trainer in CFT. Her work integrates clinical practice, teaching, and research on compassion, trauma, and mind-body connection. Together with Niki, there's Simone Cheli, Professor Simone Cheli, clinical psychologist and adjunct university. He is also director of Evolution of Personality Lab, a research group dedicated to exploring how human evolution can contribute to the conceptualization and treatment of personality disorders. Dr. Cheli is the author of over 100 scientific publications, including the book A Dimensional Approach to Schizotypy, co-edited with Paul Lizacker and published by Springer in 2023. So I'll give the vote to Niki and Simone right away. There we are. Thank you, Maurizio. I really want to thank you and then Professor Dweck who is gifting us with her wisdom. And also, I would like to thank Professor Mancini. I was a student at the School of Cognitive Psychotherapy, and the approach Amelia and Francesco will deal with later was, to me, the very first revolutionary approach. I've always been an enthusiast of new age and techniques, new techniques. And I have to say that before taking classes at that school, I was interested in a more classical cognitive school. But then I started to understand how our mind works, thanks to what Francesco Mancini and his teachers there. Um, that was for me a revolution. And I really want to thank him because the work I have been doing with compassion has been really inspired by and enriched by what I learned at his school. So it's really an approach to motivations that is really great for me. And thank you, Maurizio, to you as well, because discussing motivations and needs has always been a common denominator, a guiding thread in our meetings. So for this afternoon, I would like to try to discuss this topic not from a theoretical viewpoint, because I would not have the competence and the expertise to do so, but I would like to connect to what is about clinical practice. So I try to understand how this can be connected to CFT. So to understand what changes with our clients in the session, and what compassion can add to it if we consider it as a motivation in this framework. So let me just share a few slides. And before, my premise would be that I agree with the statement where it is said that motivation is like a place where we all are, like that this is a topic overlooked. It's easier to study emotions and feelings rather than motivations. And it's easier to activate and trigger anger rather than a motivation. I think it's a completely different task. But by working in the mindfulness field and its third generation techniques with Simone, we have been working together because we are very excited about these techniques we use with our clients. And we understood that the intention behind and the need that leads to choose mindfulness, for example, are really crucial to the outcome. I'm thinking of mindfulness, but I would say also CFT. So you can try to not to connect to one emotion. So the motivation that gives rise to the decision of following a technique or another is absolutely key and crucial. And it is what has really guided me to go for some techniques and not others. Among all of the different goals and needs that Professor Dweck listed in her paper, there are some among which mindfulness, like a neutral practice, is performed with a performance attitude. You get one outcome. If you do mindfulness without this need of performing, but with the need of staying with, then you get a different outcome. And I wasn't able, unfortunately, to find many experimental articles and papers to demonstrate that, but I think there are a few. And as far as Professor Dweck's model is concerned, I think that um, it differs from the one of CFT because in Dweck's model there are three basic needs: predictability, acceptance, and competence. And the need for self-coherence is at the center. And in this respect, I was thinking of the organization of these needs, but not from a developmental viewpoint, because actually we have been talking about developmental perspectives a lot, but I was positively surprised by the decision not to organize these needs from a developmental perspective, whereas CFT as well as Liotti's model do so. So they follow a evolutionary line, whereas this model puts together some needs that are intra and interpersonal, like the need for acceptance is relational, but differs from the need for competence that is more an interpersonal need. So the first thing I have noticed is that the two models differ in this sense. So something that is looking inside and something that is more outside oriented. In CFT, we like, of course, evolution so much because human beings evolve and develop, maybe not always in a functional manner, but the first thing I would like to focus on is that in our approach is really explaining needs from an evolutionary viewpoint. So we like to distinguish non-social needs, so basic needs, like there's a fire, so I read to run away. And Maurizio is criticizing me, or Francesco is criticizing me and has a very judgmental look, so I run away from them. So there is a different type of threat. One is a non-social threat, like a fire, whereas a judgmental look is more a social threat because there's a risk of isolation. According to Paul Gilbert's approach, there is an additional motivational status, which is the compassion one. If we think in this perspective, I think that our clients can be helped because there is an element which is not choosing that need, because in a clinical interview we have always explained our clients the nature of needs, but clients always ask us, why do I have this need? Well, our approach is aimed at helping clients just to relax and say, so this is something that you have not chosen, like coping strategies. We do not choose coping strategies. It's coping strategies that choose us. So before explain what compassion is, in CFT, there are some different directions when we have to create categories of needs. Again, social and non-social levels, but not just that. Inside out and outside in needs. So a need for competence or a need for trust. So I'm thinking of a client of mine who used to say, I don't trust myself. So it's trust is not just between human beings, but it's also trusting oneself. So in CFT, we really stress the importance of motivations that are towards ourselves. And there's something that really that I really like in the conceptualization of needs, because even it might sound trivial, I think that it's really about predictability. So if I explain my clients that this is something that is this is a need, it's not chosen, there is less judgment against oneself. As a matter of fact, besides the taxonomy we use, it is very useful to tell our clients that we all have some psychological needs that are as valid as the physical needs we have, because clients are resistant to accepting these, as all physical needs are all valid, whereas psychological needs are chosen. So it's a little bit my fault if I am so needy. So I like to help clients understanding that psychological needs are not chosen by us. Then in the recent months, I have received an email by Maurizio, and he was inviting me to think of unmet needs as causes of psychopathology. So can we think of psychopathology as an unmet need? And this means that in therapy, we need to try to meet all of the needs, or by the way, virtual reality ways of meeting needs could be included in our therapy. Well, is it the case? Well, for CFT, and also according to other approaches, if frustration explains psychopathology, then I think we would see more and more people with a psychopathology. So I would say that with our clients, it would be important to understand what the person does when there is an unmet need, when there is a discrepancy between our ideal self and our real self. So CFT places importance not just on meeting needs, but also on how to cope with needs that are not met. Because there's a system of self-aggression that is at stake. Because there is an attempt to try to meet the need in all possible ways, but this is causes sort of self-attack. And that is absolutely true, because it's not the unmet needs that are causing psychopathology, but it's the way a person copes with the frustration of unmet needs that causes psychopathology. And many studies really focus on the transdiagnostic element of our psychopathology. And in this sense, it's not just a focus on the need that is not met, but it's more what the client did to manage this frustration. And this is indeed a review that has been recently published by Professor Mancini in this respect. And that's why compassion becomes fundamental here. So while I was trying to understand why compassion was needed in a sense of inner kindness, I think that compassion is needed to cope with those frustrations due to unmet needs. We cannot meet all of our needs in therapy or in our real life. So we need to face the fact that some needs cannot be met. And this is a human approach. And if we adopt it, clients can be helped because we think that compassion arises from the caring system. We are not turtles. We do not have a shell. But in a way, we have a different reproduction system than turtles. So we need caring, we need a soothing system. And according to compassion, this soothing has extended when the mind becomes aware of some facts, pain and suffering that we cannot escape because we develop, we age, and then we die. And Yalom calls these existential pains. So I think that when the brain develops, as well as this capacity develops, another need was coming up. It's a way of navigating this pain that cannot be modified, because in the end, these are reality data that cannot be changed. So compassion evolved with the fact that we are aware that something cannot be changed. So the idea is that compassion is a particular sensitivity to suffering of oneself and of others, combined with a strong need and commitment to alleviate that suffering. But we this is regardless of the fact that a need can be met or not. And I would like to give you an example here. Unlike biological systems that regulate pain by meeting needs, so food, safety, attachment, some existential pains cannot be met. So there is no form of attachment that we can refer to, because there are some states where the person does not need attachment figures, but needs instead compassion figures. And I would like to give you an example in this sense. Some time ago, I was using EMDR techniques. So it was in between imagery rescripting and EMDR. It's a new model called compassion focused EMDR therapy. So we wanted to use bilateral stimulation, not just to desensitize the trauma, but to create alternative scenarios. I was working with a client called Dave who was bullied, and he was telling me that in previous therapies, the EMDR therapist asked him to work on the need of being cared for. And all of the imagery scripting was about a person coming in and taking care of him. But he would say that this trauma would not be solved. There was still a need there in that memory that was not met by this caring person. And so I asked him once, what would you like to do, Dave? What would that child need indeed? And Dave said, well, that child needs someone to tell me that things cannot change, that this is the way things went. So it was a sort of radical validation, as if that child needed not just a biological something, but someone to tell him, I can be with you in this trauma memory, but nothing will change. So I got from this example the idea that this is not a need to get rid of the pain, but to validate the pain and contain it by accepting it. So the idea I'm trying to explain here is that compassion reminds us that some forms of resolution of pain do not match the meeting of a need. So this is the message, the take-home message to me. And of course, compassion is also a sort of paradox, because if on the one side needs are met and lead to a reduction of the arousal, so when the need is met, the system loses its intensity. And in compassion focused therapy, we know that that pain, that is an existential pain, cannot be shut down because it exists. So compassion becomes more of a chronic attitude, which does not lead to a shutting down of our physiology. And with Cristina Ottaviani and Maria Di Bello, we have carried out a study to show that when you stay with suffering with compassion, and that suffering is also an unmet need. If you adopt a compassionate attitude, the first part of the compassionate reaction is a distress, because I connect to your need and there is no immediate resolution. But what happens later is that there is an increase of the sympathetic system and then an activation of the parasympathetic system, and both are sustained. So it's the idea of compassion is that it can work in some conditions where the need or the pain cannot be solved. And this is, I think, something that clients ask us. So to think of the client's history and see the client not as a person looking for someone to solve their trauma, but more as paying respect to that trauma, knowing that it cannot be resolved. Then another couple of thoughts I would like to ask Professor Dweck to comment on. The fact that frustration of a need can lead to psychology is something I question, as well as meeting too much a need would also cause a psychopathology. So if I have a need for competence and mastery, do I have to meet a need in any way, or just also add a dose of frustration? Because a need for belonging and being accepted is very high during adolescence, for example. And maybe that could lead to some clinical manifestations if there is too much of predictability in an environment. So that need is hyper met, so to say. So could this lead to psychopathology or some to clinical presentations? I think that this could be actually the case. And then another thing I would like to table here is the idea of self-coherence. I'm drawing my conclusions then. Well, it is true that we need to be able to find stability of self-perception and of our states. But how can this be related to the growth mindset? Because if I grow, then I could grow to an extent where I would need to question my self-coherence. For instance, I grow up to a point, and to be better, that the need for self-coherence is frustrated. I need like a softening of that self-coherence need. Because on the one hand, too much of self-coherence could lead to rigidity in a sense. And I was particularly fascinated recently by studies on mindfulness and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. because I think that they lead to a positive entropy of the brain. So there is less self-coherence, and a depressed client can, by using psychedelics, navigate through states that were unseen before, whereas an excess of self-coherence could not allow to navigate these states. So I was particularly fascinated by these new trends because I think that excess could also lead to some problems. I also appreciated a lot of what Professor Dweck said about growth mindset, because a growth mindset is functional within a social context. And from some studies, I remember the phenomenon of John and reason. So if you want, you can. If you want to grow, you can grow. And this has a iatrogenic effect on some population groups on some groups of people that do not have some capacities. So what if you have a growth mindset, but you lack a social environment where this expansion can take place? So I think this could also lead to some problems. So this growth mindset is such when it is within a context of emotional safety. And this means that errors are accepted, tolerated. There is a realistic understanding of social boundaries. So the idea is that these needs can be faced with the awareness of where they come from. So hyper meeting these needs or not meeting these needs can lead to disorder or a clinical manifestation, depending also on the context, on the environment. So this is a set of thoughts. Now I give the floor to Simone.
Thanks, Niki. So I wanted to present a critical perspective, meaning that I wanted to reflect on how sometimes the questions, what are your needs, is one of the questions we can ask the patient. And in some cases, what the patient perceives as his problem is is searching for a need. So somehow connecting to what we have been saying so far, I want to see what we can mean as needs and motivations from an evolutionary perspective. I will start from an unexpected detour in the world of primates. I don't know, these are the Wustiti, small monkeys ranging in size from 5-7 centimeters to just over 20 if we include tail. They diverge from the phylogenetic lineage of apes at least 40-45 million years ago. And we thought that they had to do with very early primates, but in fact, it's a attempt to adapt to biological niches which are very close, but at the same time very different, like moving from different quarters of London or of Jerusalem, where to adapt, I need to have very different mindset. The surprising thing about these animals, these marmosets, is that they have aesthetical differences which somehow influence the sexual or the survival, sexual aspects and survival. But they created personal and group needs which are completely different from patriarchal groups, very aggressive or monogamous structure, cooperative groups in a very short time. Why did I want to talk to you about this? Because to be able to understand what we mean for motivations and needs from an evolutionary perspective, broadening up our perspective, we need to remember that the somatic and behavioral traits on which we create a basis, foundations of the needs and of motivations, somehow evolves with the behavioral traits, co-evolve with the behavioral traits, and not to optimize the adaptability to a specific trait on a trait-specific targets, but to influence the functioning of the individual altogether. We have to remember that when we speak about the ability to adapt and the onset of pathologies, that the evolution is not an intelligent design, that traits included personality traits, schemas, needs, emotions are not to be considered optimal designs. What does it mean? It means that they emerge in a random with a random causation, and they don't follow a pro and cons rationale. We cannot understand a single trait, but we have to understand the individual as a whole in the way and the interface between the individual and the environment. If we go back to humans and we try to see with those environment like the emotional and the metacognitive situations, things are not so clear as we would like them to be. First of all, we have to remember that the brain, not only in the humans and the Homo sapiens, but in all the forms of complex development, is not designed with the goal of thinking or feeling emotions, but to integrate information from different systems. In the film, in a meta-analysis about emotions for us, psychology, that we love taxonomy, and the work is the meta-analysis by Feldman Barrett, is that the idea that there are physiological fingerprints specific to individual emotions, in fact, is not evidence supported, doesn't have robust evidence supporting that. And when we inquire how the psychopathology emerges with the mentalization, for example, there are clear transcultural differences in the different ages of onset, and we use different tools. For example, there is a study where they compare the children in Maya communities, South America, or with children from the USA or from Asia. What is different is that the relational interpersonal tools are completely different, but also functions, for example, more complex processes which comes from different motivational needs are different. For example, they studied the effect of perfectionism, the strive to perfectionism in non-clinical subjects from Britain and from Japan, and they saw that in the British group, the perfectionist strive would cause distress. In the Japanese one, it would cause a sense of relief. This not because we have to think that there is just one model, but we have to think that when we talk about motivation and needs, the environment is crucial, and the interplay between the person and the environment is crucial. And quite often, the models that include self-determination are Western or are extremely characterized by the Western culture. I read a book written by a Chinese author, The Need for Justice is a Western value. It doesn't mean anything in a different culture, like the Chinese culture, or the integration of needs of different mindsets and integrated mindsets, like Niki was mentioning before. If we read Indian psychologists, the architecture, the subjective architecture of the Indian self would be based on a non-integration of the co-presence of contrasting elements. So what is the take-home message here is that the cultural system are analogous to a genotype, and cultural transmission and learning are analogous to mating and breeding in terms of evolutionary biology. This means that sometimes there are paradoxical situations where a psychological construct is in fact an ex post reconstructions of dynamic, irreversible, evolved processes. And what we define today as a need might be the effect of a probabilistic process. But not only, in addition, we need to consider that the speed of cultural development follows an exponential curve compared to a slower biological development. Therefore, the difficulty in defining what is a need, if it is frustrated or not, is something that happens on the stage of a mismatch between, for example, if we consider attachment as an example, for 300,000 years, we have grown up in a tribe where the relationship of a one-to-one relationship between a parent and a child was completely absent or rare, to Western-like and systems of the last century and a half, where there is a one-to-one relationship which biologically was somehow determined. There is a psychologist who says that the neglect as a attachment need frustrated would be the result of this mismatch. The main points from my perspective to consider what Niki was said and the attempt to create a theory of motivation and the needs and goals like Carol was suggesting. First of all, there is one aspect from the neurobiological aspect is the social dimension. We have to develop this complex device, which is the neocortex, to face the complexity of our spaces, which has to live in unusually complex societies. The idea suggested by Paul Gilbert is that we had to integrate, and we always need to deal with the integration between motivation, needs with an easier biological origin, with some need about mentalization, understanding of what happened to other people that are always or that are increasingly more demanding. Therefore, I think that we can consider any formulation of motives and needs as embedded in a specific cultural context or framework, and which is important because we are defined by the social context and that it would be very interesting to investigate how human beings are able to adapt to specific social environments to construct what we define ex post motivation, motives and needs. So the idea that all the forms of life are able to use their structure to understand the environment, but since the cultural dimension is so dynamic, it's crucial to understand how we have a bio and psychological framework that enable us to reformulate what are our needs and our motives. It could be interesting to investigate on this, maybe with an evolutionary framework, understanding how this constructive capacity about motivations has evolved and why it evolved both from a phylogenetic and ontogenetic level. All these to confuse us a little bit more. From my perspective, it was very important to remind this ability. And one of the principles of compassion-focused therapy is that of being able to tailor to the patient its conceptualization. For example, if we work with a narcissistic patient who arrive to the session and he says, you know, everybody says my problem is to satisfy my need, and you are telling me what are my needs. And maybe we are, in fact, in therapy, helping him to satisfy his real needs and the ability to understand a little bit better about his social experience, his history, and his experiences in relationship. Thank you, Simone. If I can add something or join you in your dialogue, I have a proposal. First of all, since I realized that we get more and more ideas that we could discuss, I suggest if Carol Dweck feels like connecting to some of the things that emerged in this dialogue about the compassion-focused therapy, or if someone else, in addition to Professor Carol Dweck, feels the need to connect to what has been said with their reflections and ideas, using this last bit of time before the discussion between Francesco Mancini and Amelia Gangemi, we could use this time to discuss.
Yes, I would love to. Niki and Simone, thank you for those wonderful and stimulating thoughts. First of all, I love taking an evolutionary perspective. And my colleague James Gross and I have been discussing how in pre-human organisms, a lot more reflexes, a lot more instincts built in. Why for us more needs? The needs create the flexibility to adapt to a culture, to a new environment. But they also provide the flexibility to go wrong. So this greater flexibility has underpinned all our great achievements and adaptations, but also has supported clinical psychologists. Niki asked, was supporting needs too much a problem? I could very easily go with the idea that there's an optimal level of meeting each need. That's why I called it optimal predictability. But as you point out, too much emphasis on competence, certain kinds of smothering acceptance. Yeah, so optimal needs appeal to me. The idea that this is a Western theory, mine is Western theory, and yes, I acknowledge that in the paper, but I also talk about ways in which culture can be included or studied in relation to the needs and how Eastern and Western cultures might work differently. Growth mindset. Yes. You can't and shouldn't have a growth mindset about everything. We all must choose when, how much to grow, and also whether we have the support and tools and prior knowledge to grow optimally. We are very much aware of the importance of context. We have programs that teach students how to learn and apply a growth mindset, and they work. But if the teacher creates a fixed mindset culture where you can't raise your hand, say, I'm confused. You can't say, can you repeat that again? Or you can't make mistakes publicly. They cannot put that growth mindset into practice, even though they learned it in the program and demonstrated it. The environment has to be appropriate for and supportive of ways that you're trying to change or grow. Let me see. Yeah, I wondered in terms of compassion for a past trauma. I wondered whether sometimes a past trauma can make you into a person who can then try to help other people. You can use it in a meaningful way to make a contribution, while accepting that you cannot change the past. I thought that I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carol. You have been very brief and timely. And I don't want to close the discussion, but I would like to now leave the floor to Francesco Mancini and Amelia Gangemi, so that we can, after their presentation, take all the ideas and suggestions that have been presented so far and discuss further. Now, I will introduce you to Francesco Mancini and Amelia Gangemi. We are talking about cognitive psychotherapy here. Francesco Mancini is a child neuropsychiatry and psychotherapist. He's the director of the SPC network. He is an extraordinary professor of clinical psychology at Guglielmo Marconi University, Rome, author of numerous publications in books and peer-reviewed journals. He has long been dedicated to the study of cognitive processes and emotions, in particular guilt and the processes of maintaining and aggravating emotional suffering, the neurotic paradox, and has recently published book with Amelia Gangemi, who is professor of cognitive psychology at the School of Specialization in Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, directed by Francesco Mancini, and also a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Messina. She holds a PhD in general and clinical psychology and has long studied the interaction between emotions, reasoning, and psychopathology. She has published many work with Francesco Mancini. Her research investigates how emotional processes influence reasoning, particularly in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety disorders, and depression. She is the author of numerous scientific articles and books, and recently edited, together with Francesco Mancini, the book Paradoxes of Psychopathology, edited by Cortina in 2024. And I leave promptly the floor to you. Thank you very much to Carol Dweck for accepting our invitation, and her work, as it has already been said, really has triggered a great interest in our work. I wanted to thank also Maurizio Brasini for chairing and organizing this interesting meeting. Our intervention by Amelia and myself refers specifically on the idea or the need of justice. As an introduction, I would like to remember that some years ago, I was part of a conference and we had a chance to hear Vitusek professor from Hawaii University, who is an expert in anorexia and eating disorders in general. And she was comparing in a very nicely argumented way on the psychological profile of anorectic patients and those who do base jumping or other extreme sports. The conclusion she drew was that anorectic behaviors can be considered as a form of extremism, as the superinvestment of one motivation compared to the other. So the anorectic controls weight and sacrifices studies, health, and relationship. It seemed to me important to include other disorder into extremism. For example, the obsessive compulsive disorder. If we imagine an obsessive compulsive disorder patient who invests, like long time in decontamination, sacrificing his social life, his working life, and the same is for personality disorders. An avoiding personality, an avoidant patient is someone preoccupied with the possibility of being excluded, not accepted, and excluded in a humiliating way, and therefore he invests on this, on avoiding this possibility. That's where he invests all his resources. Some weeks ago, Mauro Giacomantonio, colleague and friend, teacher of social psychology at the University of Rome, sent me a very recent paper by Kruglansky, a social psychologist, where he suggests that all extremisms are characterized by an overinvestment in one need to the expense of the other. And the opposite is the motivational imbalance. That is one need at the expense of other needs. In the second case, when there is a balance, the resources are reasonably distributed among the different needs. Therefore, the extremism among which the psychopathological disorders can be interpreted as an expression of an hyper-investment, over-investment on one need at the expense of other needs. With Amelia Gangemi and Jim Johnson-X, we have analyzed the effect of over-investment. And now the floor to Amelia, who briefly will describe the consequences of an overinvestment in terms of cognitive processes. Amelia, to you.
So there's a problem indeed when this need is threatened. So what happens then? Well, hyper emotions get activated. So excessive emotions that are very intense, anxiety, anger, guilt, shame. What do these emotions do? They orient our cognitive processes, and this lead to the increase of the imbalance. To make myself clearer, we need to make a premise. Our cognitive processes, and this is something that I repeat a lot to my students, are at the service of our emotions. So they are at the service of our motives as well. So let's think of all of the theories in this sense. But our cognitive processes that are oriented or guided by emotions reduce the risk of making crucial mistakes that are very severe mistakes, according to the principle processed by Friedrich, the primary error detection and minimization. This orientation aimed at reducing the chance of making severe mistakes leads us to avoid underestimating threats, avoiding overestimating reassurance, and orient also all of the other cognitive processes like attention, so that attention is devoted to important needs and not to less important needs. What is the consequence of this imbalance? The consequence is that the imbalance is maintained and even worsened, and this happens despite the imbalance is dysfunctional. And in this sense, I would like to ask Francesco to delve into the clinical part with some clinical examples that could be helpful for our audience. Yes, for sure. I would like to give you an example for the avoidant personality disorder. So the main need there is the need for being accepted. As a consequence of past experiences, these clients are presenting themselves as humiliating and rejecting, and they do not want to be excluded. And this can lead to two consequences. On the one side, some weak signals of availability are seen as a confirmation that the others will be humiliating and they will reject. And there is also another scenario that leads to avoiding self-realization from a romantic viewpoint. So this imbalance in favor of a need for acceptance and not being humiliated and rejected is fueled, as well as the frustration of other needs. So the higher the investment, the higher the orientation of cognitive processes towards that one direction, the stronger the imbalance. So it's a vicious cycle that is often found in clients. I'll give you another example about BPD disorder. So there is a need there that is for being loved. And in this instance too, the chance not to be loved and being abandoned is experienced as a catastrophe. And as a consequence, cognitive processes are oriented in order to prevent abandonment and to make this being seen as a right, being accepted and being loved. So the two consequences are maybe a delayed phone call that can trigger fear of abandonment. And the second consequence is the risk of have excessive behaviors that can cause further consequences. And I'll give you the floor back, Amelia. Yes, there's an aspect that needs to be underlined, as if the mind is completely unbalanced and just fine-tuned on one channel, cannot intercept other signals. So the question would be here, what are the cognitive and mental ingredients that can favor this unbalance? So it's important to understand this. What is the reason why this unbalance of motives is determined and kept? Well, this refers to another key concept that becomes fundamental for us. It's the concept of range and I would say acceptable range. Mm, We need to say that no need, generally speaking, is completely met, or no need is completely unmet. Events can be partially satisfactorily or partially unsatisfactorily. In other words, the idea is that there is a threshold within which we can learn and to tolerate frustration. And if I can share an example here in our daily experience, I can think of my experience as a teacher when, for example, there are examinations, and often I see different reactions in students when faced with the same mark I give them. Just think of a student that has an average score. Well, I a reaction could be, well, that's fine, not too bad. It's not that excellent, but it's acceptable. Whereas there is another reaction of a student that can be, this is a catastrophe. And the student says, no, I had to get the best score. So what's the difference there that characterizes these two reactions? Well, we think that it's really about the range. What comes out is a difference related to the width of the range. So with the first reaction, so the score is not too bad. The range is very wide, whereas with the second reaction, I had to get the best mark. The range is very narrow. Well, actually, it's just focused and concentrated on one point only. I think you should add something here, Francesco. So here we should add another important segment. The question would be, what determines the width of this range? Our thesis is that the definition of what is acceptable is related to the representations of a fair world. So every one of us has a representation of what is good and bad. So the range of frustration and performance that is good to us, that is normal and that is consistent. So it really matches the idea of what we can expect from life. So a wide range is a good expectation, which is also taking into consideration one's own merits. And if we consider innate merits and not just the learned merits, for example, there is a common idea according to which a child, because he or she exists, should just be cared and loved. And here I would like to say and stress that this is not a neutral representation, but it is a representation that has an important value within it. In the literature, this is defined, thanks to Lerner, as a need for a just world. This is a need, as all of the other needs, that includes goals and values that influence our interpretation of human experience. And to this extent, we could also refer to the Totem system. It looks as in a systematic way, this monitoring of the matching between perceived reality and the representation of this just world is recognized. If we perceive a discrepancy between the two, there is a mismatch. First, we have negative emotional reactions like disappointment, anger, but then there is also an attempt of restoring this matching. But this can also be impossible. So what do we have to do? Well, one possibility would be to protest. And protesting is aimed at witnessing what is just. If you read the news in these days, you'll see so many massive manifestations that are organized in favor of Palestine. The idea would be that you have to restore the correct representation. And according to some studies by Lerner, if there is a situation with a victim and we cannot restore the matching between perceived reality and the representation of a just world, well, we can use the derogation of the victim. So we assign the victim the merit, or in inverted commas, of what happened to this victim. Like you deserve to be treated like that, or you have not protected yourself, especially when there are rapes. Another aspect about the need for a just world. The idea would be that the need for a just world needs to comply with the three criteria that are used to define basic psychological needs. So first, the need for a just world does not come from other needs. So it's not instrumental to other needs. So we try to meet this need, even if there is no positive consequence. And an individual can get angry when faced to injustice, also experienced by other individuals in remote areas. So it's a matter of fairness and justice. Also, 5-year-old children can bear a cost, like rejecting or declining an award, and want the rule to be observed by paying a cost for that, even though they are not involved. And then the second feature of the need for a just world is that it is innate. Studies have used the paradigm of ultimatum gain that I just tried to sum up. So the experimenter gives an individual like 100 euros and then gives a task. I gave you 100 euros. Now you have to make a decision how much money you want to give to another person. And what is observed is that the person that gives money to the other person gives a given amount of money that is under the threshold. The person that receives this amount of money is offended and so reclines this amount of money. Whereas if you give like 10 euros out of 100, the person that receives 10 euros declines this amount of money. And the person who this amount of money was offered had an advantage because 10 euros is better than nothing. So there's another variable that comes into place, which is the variable of respect, fairness, justice. Well, it is interesting to know that 2-year-old children have exactly the same reaction to offers that they consider to be unjust, non-just. And this is also observed in apes or primates that like two different types of vegetables, grapes and cucumbers. But if in a cage there are two monkeys and I offer a cucumber to one and some grapes to the other one, the monkey who received the cucumber would throw it to me because there is an intuition of justice and fairness. And so it's probably innate. And then the need for a just world also gives rise to some disorders, and one of them is a disorder that is determined by some injustice, unfairness schemes, especially among OCD clients. Schemas of retaliations, for example. The perception of living in a just world is accompanied to a sense of well-being. And if you think you live in an unjust world, that is accompanied by a feeling of distress. And we are getting to the essence now of this conversation. Every outcome, whether it is positive or negative, can be assessed positively or negatively depending on the need for a just world. So it can be considered just, that you deserve it, or unjust, that you do not deserve it. And this influences its positive or negative value in terms of acceptability. As Niki was saying, of course, we cannot expect to have all our needs met. So also how to manage those unmet needs of our clients. Well, that would be a way to manage them, accepting them. Acceptance is fundamental because it's the perception of justice. So the need for a just world is superordinate to other needs. And this depends on the outcome, whether it is considered just or not just. The connotation of an outcome or an object as deserved or not increases its positive value and reduces its negative value. And the opposite applies to this if the object is not deserved. The need for a just world has also been object of different research studies, but we think that the need for a just world is not just a need next to the other needs, but it is a superordinate need because it determines the acceptance of the frustration of unmet needs.
And in fact, I would like to add that the justice need modulates the need for a just world, modulates the value we attribute to events. So what I am saying connects to a series of phenomena that have been studied in the cognitive psychology. I want to just talk about three. The first is the effort value, the subjective value of the outcome of an object increases if it is recognized as the result of a series of efforts I have used. So the value is given to the commitment, the sacrifice, the efforts I used to achieve this situation. And this is a surplus compared to any other value I have obtained in a random or way, so in a free way, without efforts, without doing anything. What we observe is that people tend to give a higher value to an object, to something, when they think they deserved it, even though there is no rational foundation behind it. The value of the good, of the things, is the same. It's interesting that the criterion is used also in evaluating what other people do. When we recognize that the people have obtained something thanks to their effort, we somehow attribute a greater value to that achievement. This criterion is important also for things that have to do with other people. I think it's very interesting to mention what is called the IKEA effect. It's been studied a couple of years ago. What is this IKEA effect? Is that we characterize something of greater value, something a good, something that we contributed to build, or reconnecting to IKEA that we have assembled somehow. So we give surplus value to an object or something that to something that we have contributed to build, rather than something that has been given to me already built. Another effect is the endowment effect. Well, how does it work? An object increases its value, has a surplus value, when it is recognized by us as something which belongs to us. It's mine, compared to the fact that we recognize it as something belonging to someone else. What is the interesting aspect here is that, by definition, an object cannot be ours unless its belonging is considered deserved or just. So we give more value to what belongs to us because it's ours. So we think that somehow we are entitled to have it. So this is not a rational effect. There is no real change in the value of the object, but the fact of feeling it belongs to us makes it more precious in our eyes. And here, if we want to give an example, by a research by Kahneman written in the 90s, it's the cup experiment. If I give a cup to a group of subjects and then I ask them, in the moment they consider that the cup is theirs, to sell it and to establish what is the price for the sale, what we observe is that the average price that the people establish is higher to the price that another group that needs to buy is ready to pay in order to buy the object. Why? Because we consider it belongs to us. And the idea is that I sell it and I value it more because it's hard for me to lose it. And the third phenomenon, quite known, it's the loss aversion, which was introduced and studied by Dr. Eshkol Kahneman. And what does it say? This phenomenon is that, in general, we observe a significant tendency to perceive the loss as like a higher or heavier loss compared to the equivalent gain. What it means that losing 100 euro for me is more painful, or what gaining or 100 euro might make me happy. What does it mean? That the negative effect is considered as more severe and creates suffering if it is considered as a loss and not as a missed gain. What is the difference between a loss and a missed gain? Because when I missed the gain, I have the fact that I didn't gain something. I wasn't able to have it. So it's difficult to think to lose something that you don't have already. And here I'm thinking of an example that Francesco made many times when we discussed about this, which is the lottery example. Yes, it's an anecdote of many years ago. One year I wanted to buy the lottery, New Year's lottery ticket for 10 euro, like a sum like that. And of course I didn't win. The fact that I didn't win didn't change anything, was not a problem. In the same situation, there were people to which the minister of finance, of economy, said that they had won the prizes, and the prizes were, million of euros. And they were all happy. After 15 days, the minister says, no, we were wrong. You didn't win anything. It's intuitive how the reaction was different. I didn't have any gain, I didn't win anything. For them, it was on the contrary, the subtraction of something that they thought they had won, because the minister had created the expectation as if it said, it's yours, you have already won. And I think that was the cause of the reaction of these people. I think they actually somehow asked for damages to the state. What do we want to highlight here? That the need for a just word interacts with other needs, modifying the value of the outcomes, but also the level of acceptability. So negative event is more severe comparing to the fact that it threatens the representation of a word, of a just word. So it depends also on accommodating our representation of a just word to this event. And it is, there are evidence that says that painful events are more acceptable to compare to events that are considered as unjust. If we imagine the death of a dear ones, of an old one, it can be painful and even very painful, but usually it is experienced as something which is in the natural order and therefore acceptable, just. We can consider that it would have been better if the person could have lived longer to see nieces and nephews, or to, but this is experienced as a gift, as something more that the destiny, the fate might have given, not something that should have happened. Compared to this, the death of a young person is much more painful because it compromises what is considered as the just natural order. It's more painful than the previous case, but it's also more difficult to accept because it violates what was legitimate to be expected. The acceptance is, on a philosophical level, also the recognition of the congruence between a negative event and the intuitive perception of the natural order of things, of divine will or destiny. And here I want to observe, which is something I know that Maurizio also is very fond of. I do not agree with the definition of acceptance given by ACT as an avoidance of the experiential avoidance, which seems to me quite a reductive definitions. On acceptance, many people have focused, and on which also Marco Aurelio, the historic, he writes an entire book on accepting things, the frustration of our needs, death, illness, and since he was also someone prone to anger, also the weaknesses of others. Acceptance for him was, in fact, being able to realize that whatever happens somehow is part of the logos, which is an immanent order which organizes everything and therefore should be accepted. This helps me to introduce another concept, which is how can we explain a traumatic event? When does an event become traumatic? If we think in terms of this theory, an event becomes traumatic when it threatens the representation of a just world. When we wonder, but why did it happen to me? And many times the patients say so. And of course, these questions shows the research of a causal motivation, but there is also the need to research for a meaning, for a moral explanation. The trauma can be seen as an existential crisis. Why? Because it somehow shatters the representation that we can see as a very intuitive, implicit representation of what is the good events or bad events that might happen to us. So the traumatic event becomes traumatic because it undermines our implicit representation of the natural order. Professor Brasini some years ago presented a very interesting paper, but now I would like to talk about the last point, which is the implications for psychotherapy. We often observe there is an imbalance in the motivation in favor of some goals that articulate a specific need, which is overinvested to the expenses of others. We suggest that the overinvestment depends on the connotation of the frustration of the need as an event that shouldn't happen because it contrasts what the patient thinks should happen to himself and therefore is unacceptable. So the objective of psychotherapy is to extend the range of acceptable frustrations and reduce the range of not met needs. So now we need to say that what I have said so far resonates with the fact that cognitive psychotherapy, for example, Ellis or cognitive theory by Beck, where acceptance is the pivot, the center, it's the functional alternative to the experiential avoidance with the aim of enabling a commitment towards one's goals. So acceptance can, as I said before, considered as the opposite of the avoidance. All the therapy's approaches highlights acceptance, but what are the main ideas? There are three ideas connected. The first is that the larger part of psychopathological disorders is connected to an imbalance in the motivations with the aim of safeguarding or protecting a need at the expense of others. And this triggers a series of processes that tends to maintain this overinvestment. The second, despite its dysfunction, the second idea is that this overinvestment is due to the intervention of the representation of a just world which defines the range of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And third, acceptance is the assimilation of an event and the representation of a just word and an accommodation to the event. These are the three ideas. The last one can be found in many philosophical systems, and in particular, I like to mention Marco Aurelio. And here we are with our take-home message. What can we say? First of all, that we are ethical beings. So we have an intuitive and pervasive representation of what each person deserves or does not deserve. And this is crucial for understanding and treating psychological disorders, but because it defines the level of frustration that are acceptable. And they become the focus of the intervention.
Thank you to Francesco Mancini and Amelia Gangemi. Thank you to all of the speakers. Actually, I feel as I was invited by a Christmas dinner cooked by wonderful and generous chefs. So we are just waiting for the dessert now. And I think that we still have 800 people in the audience because there has been almost 1,000 people the whole time, and it's a wonderful message for us. So we have some time now for our final discussion, and there have been many interesting inputs. I would like to start a dialogue based on these inputs. So I would like to start with Carol something first. Of course, you can answer some of these inputs, or you can also ask questions. I think I could start by identifying 5 points, 5 items I have taken notes of, and please feel free to pick one to start a dialogue with one of the speakers, and also all of the speakers can feel free to contribute. Because that's the moment of a symposium, a moment of sharing. So the 5 topics, the 5 things I have identified are the following. So the first one by Eshkol, the optimal predictability. So is it an epistemic need? It is a need that refers to the knowledge of the world. And what it is, the relationship with self-coherence, it is a problem of stability of oneself and the world, or is there anything else? Second theme about self-coherence. I would like to quote article, the paper by Carol, sorry. I almost know it by heart because I've read it so many times. And she says, talking about self-coherence, that there are 2 main points. Identity responds to the question, who am I? And includes social roles, social categories, and other areas that define and position people, whereas the need for meaning answers the question how the world should be. So I think that in the definition of self-coherence by Carol and the distinction between identity and meaning, there is a more epistemic concept and another concept that Francesco and Amelia are defining as how the world should be. So I would like a comment on this. So in self-coherence, is it all about epistemics? Then third point that was also touched upon by Niki, it's the just right idea. So the correct dose of to satisfy or to meet a need. So if I cook something, I put some salt. How much should I put? Well, it's the right dose, but it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of palate. You like to have a more salty or savory meal. So if I have a ladder going from just right at the middle, then too much or too less, what is the right amount of playfulness? And I don't know if it's a matter of play, of taste, or if there's a rule. So is it too much of it or is it too less of it? So sometimes when it's too much, you can think of better well-being, but it's not always the case. Then fourth item, fourth point, the need for justice we have been talking about is interpreted as uns very close to fairness, so it is added to the list of needs, or as Francesco, Mancini, and Amelia Gangemi, is it a crossover need, as they have explained us? And then the fifth point. I like very much the item of playfulness, but John Bowlby, I think, likes it too a lot because he wrote something in his first volume of the three ones. In a chapter, he dedicated so many words to concepts like feelings and needs, but he had some evolutionary criteria he was using, and he said something else when he touched upon playfulness and in particular about smiling, because separation cry is related to attachment and need to be soothed, but he would say that there is another behavior that is symmetrical in a mother and in a child. So I'm going to read it to you. And then I would like to ask Carol and also Eshkol and Barbara their opinion. He says, unlike cry that is effective from the birth, in lallation and smile, the behavior of a mother is influenced. And smiling and lallation can be manifested when the newborn is happy. But there was something else he said. When the child smiles and the mother responds to him with a smile and caresses him and hugs him, in this exchange, each partner expresses joy because of the presence of the other. And there is a reassurance of a prolongation of this social interaction. So it's not easy to find a term to describe this such important element of the mother's behavior. So we could think of a loving behavior. And this is one of the rare cases where he used the word love. So Carol, but also the other speakers. These are the 5 items I have identified. So feel free, Carol, to pick one of them or also ask questions yourself to the other speakers. And thank you for your availability.
I think I'm just going to endorse what Maurizio said. First, a big issue is about justice and fairness, and how the world is, should be. And one question is, are the existing needs that I proposed, predictability, trust, etc., identity and meaning, are they sufficient for us to understand justice and fairness? We could make a case either way, that justice and fairness needs to be separated and be superordinate. Or we could say it grows out of trust. Trust is the first compound need to emerge. It's fundamental to identity and meaning, and hence it assumes this superordinate meaning. I think would be a fascinating discussion. The idea of the correct dose of need fulfillment, that is fascinating and has been beautifully presented by several speakers. Saying that it depends on the individual, the culture, on whether other needs are being neglected when you focus on one need, and so forth. The idea of playfulness, that reciprocity between the smile, the reciprocation between the baby and the parent, is that loving acceptance, is this playfulness just a continuation of what happens in infancy under optimal conditions, or is it a separate need unto itself? So I'm going to stop there and let other people give their opinions or ask their questions. But I think this discussion has been fantastic.
Actually, I have a curiosity that I would like to ask Professor Dweck. When you talk about self-coherence, how it is superordinate to other needs? Because I think there can be different interpretations of it.
Yes, I propose that the self-coherence is at the center of things, and I didn't say this in my talk, but in the paper, that it provides a way of monitoring the various needs, their balance, their imbalance, met or not met. And when it detects some kind of urgency or disconnect or threat, it triggers behavior. And then I identified identity and meaning as the things that hold us together. And when threatened, can make us feel fragile.
I'd love to jump in for a second on self-coherence because we've been spending a lot of time thinking about it, even though it's not something we put into our brief interventions. We think about it. Carol, you in the paper talk about it as a master sensor of the other needs, and I really
Yeah,
like that
yeah.
term, right? So the self-coherence is this thing that a little bit like in the old Maslow or Maslowian way of thinking, it's sort of at the top of the pyramid, and you will know that you got there because there was sufficient, steps along the way. And the reason this became sort of a clinical question, first of all, well, let me start this way. The reason it became a clinical question was that in that Arndt's paper that you read and you mentioned earlier, um, um, there was an attempt that I think wasn't handled well of integrating your model into schema therapy. So that argument ended up being about whether a thwarted need for meaning, a thwarted need for identity, looks like, if that is the fundamental need that's thwarted, could you get there with all the other needs being met, and yet that need somehow not being fully met, or if automatically, if meaning and identity haven't developed or haven't developed fully, um, you would necessarily know that things have gone awry at a more fundamental level with the basic needs or or the other compound needs like trust and self-esteem and autonomy. And I think the answer is probably both. The answer, but I'm curious to hear what you think. Um, my sense is that there are many people who don't get to think about meaning and identity because they're too busy getting more basic needs met, but they're living an okay life. I think they're missing something in a world in which we have enough resources. We would work on getting them to get their meaning, getting their identity met. But if the world is very chaotic, and it is for many people, then focusing on more fundamental needs might be something that is understandable, and you might see people who aren't fragmented, who aren't uh, a mess because they still have that sense of cohesion, they have the sense of trust, they have the sense of, but it's not, a fully realized sense of identity and meaning. Just curious what your thoughts are on
Yeah.
it.
Yes. So I didn't mean to present identity and meaning as necessarily something developmentally advanced. I asked in the paper, when could this start? It could start early, as soon as there's an issue of as soon as you have some idea of predictability um, or acceptance, could this be threatened? And you see kids in the strange situation, the attachment assessment, those who have disorganized attachment. At 1 year of age, you see them falling apart when the mother leaves. You see them dissociating and acting really weird. So it could, this self-coherence could be an issue very early in development, from very early in development, and then take on new and more elaborate forms later. I think your question is so interesting. Is it the master, is self-coherence the master sensor, and it's only when the other needs go wrong that the alarm sounds, or can the other needs be met, but some higher order needs not be met in self-coherence, meaning and identity, and then the alarms go off? So I'd love to discuss that further in the future.
It's been on our mind. We have a colleague here who's a self-determination researcher who's been saying that one of the missing pieces in the autonomy need in self-determination is that it focuses so strongly on freedom from, but not enough on freedom to. So a lot on not
Yeah.
being ruled from the outside, not being governed by the outside, but not enough on what the compass, what the internal compass is.
Yes. So that's why I called that control, aut- autonomy being a key part of it, but not all of it.
And more that's part of autonomy that is a freedom from external influence and the ability
Mhm.
to govern oneself. I'm saying this partly in the context of speaking from Israel right now, where things are tough. Things have been tough, I think, in many places in the world. They're tough here. They're tough in Gaza. They're tough um, in ways that really challenge the sense of having needs met on any level. And I was listening to the discussion of a just world, or a discussion of justice more generally, with this in mind, and thinking also on the part of the discussion where Simone and Niki were speaking about sort of the evolutionary perspective. And the evolutionary perspective, for the most part, I wonder if that's the case with compassion-focused therapy, but for the most part, is often focused on the individual. It's not focused on group selection. It's not focused on the way uh, the survival of the species or the group, and it speaks at the level of individuals. But speaking about a just world and speaking about morality and moving beyond the individual to the level of the self as part of a community, or the self as part of a global community, I think is a leap that that a common language of needs can be helpful in. So if we get to the point where we can acknowledge that there's a set of universal needs, and that they are really universal, they're really shared, and that's what makes for common humanity, to use a part of self-compassion, I think, definition, this idea of common humanity. Then we have a chance maybe to move the psychology from the psychology of the individual or the small unit to the psychology of a broader sense. And I think that's something that's really challenging right now.
It's very challenging. I think about it all the time. How can we be enabled to contribute to the world in ways that help everyone and don't threaten or undermine others? It's a very challenging situation right now in so many ways. And I really value your suggestion that we can think about it in terms of community, group, world, in ways that ask us how can we all be contributing to the meeting of human needs?
And a huge part of this is first acknowledging them, right? It's first coming and sort of thinking of like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's the Universal Declaration of Human Needs as a starting point.
Interesting, interesting. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote the Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations. She chaired the committee that drafted that declaration. And maybe we as a group could draft the Declaration of Human Needs.
Yeah, if I may, let's say now, evolutionarily speaking, fitness is individual, but adaptation is at population level. And in the sense, that's the reason why I was insisting on the social perspective, social evolved functions of our psychological processes.
Yes.
And in the sense, justice is an attempt to regulate what was defined biologically, such as the social brain, to different kind of cultural sets that may vary and may ask for different cultural functions. And that's the problem in humanity, the heterogeneity created by this kind of functioning that may let the one or the group perceive the other group as not member of the same species. Because to the extent that I would not perceive the other as member of my community, I can treat it as nothing more than material, no? And that's
so
the reason why, and that's a problem that it goes beyond the human community. As an evolutionary speaking, a very modern fundamental context is, for example, so-called One Health approach, where ideas such as the problem of COVID-19, for example, is due to not having included in this large community also the animals around us and the health and environment around us, and the fact that the more we perceive, and it's very Western, ourselves as something at the peak of a pyramid, yes, then you can do everything to the others, being the other humans, animals, or environments. So, and in that sense, yes, fundamental having cultural tools, reminding that are evolved tools at cultural level.
Yes. Well said. Thank you. Maurizio, did you want to sum up?
I thank you, Carol. As a matter of fact, I would be happier if Francesco Mancini, who is the person who really wanted to translate your paper, to published a book, and this event, I would really like him to say a couple of words. He probably is gonna hate me for asking him, but you wonderfully read my mind, actually. Now, going deeply, I had a question in my head, which is, how was conceived the idea of the self-coherence? And I was able to solve this question, so I'm very satisfied because of this. But more in general, I wouldn't go more in depth into some of the topics that was raised here. I don't want to take too much time here, but I want to highlight the fact that it's very important to dedicate to the study and clinical use of motivations and goals. I think this is very important. And schema therapy work in this has been very important. And that is based also on the work of Professor Dweck. But I think this is the point here. If you pay attention to that, there is, like, part of the cognitive science, as Cristiano Castelfranchi highlights, has always had this original guilt or sin of not considering emotions, like Carol was saying in her paper. Also, the development of the theory of personalities that has been more recent on personality disorders doesn't refer differently from older traditions to needs, motivations, and goals. And these motivational aspects is really neglected in the literature. And this is a real defect, a real negative things, like Amelia was suggesting. But in many of the research we did, and not only us, of course, one of the things that emerges very clearly is that the cognitive processes are regulated exactly by motivations, emotions, triggers, goals, and action tendencies, and this orientates the cognitive processes. In other words, if we consider things from this perspective, cognitive processes are not related to the logics of scientific research, and they are not even related to desires or to the principles of confirmation of the beliefs or the previous beliefs, but to motivations and to motives. And therefore, there is a tradition, which is the cognitive tradition, that really should be enriched by the contribution of motivation. And we as clinical should do the same. So thanks to Carol for her wonderful work, to Eshkol for introducing us to her work, and to all of you for your contributions. And of course, also to Maurizio for organizing this wonderful work, and to Pietro Coletti and our translators.
I have one more thing to say in response to Francesco. I have a secret life as a neuroscientist, and we are just submitting a paper showing that the motivational, emotional parts of the brain play a fundamental role in basic cognitive processes. We have very, very strong evidence that they support and regulate cognitive processes. In the literature, they're mostly depicted as disrupting rationality and getting cognition off track. But in fact, cognition, even basic cognition, is not possible without motivation and emotion. So I'll leave it there. And I'll send you the paper shortly.
Maurizio, I wanted to add, of course, I wanted to thank all of you, and also the 5 questions or topics that you raised are very interesting. And we should organize more meetings like this one, because thanks to these questions, to the questions that you have raised and identified, we can really start research branches for the next 40 years. So thanks to all of you for that. And thanks to Carol, of course, that helped us or that triggered our interest in that.
And let me just say how exciting it was for me to hear your talks and for me to think in new ways about ideas I put out and are now coming back enriched and transformed. Thank you so much.
A real treat. So thank you all for organizing this, and Carol for inspiring it.
Okay. Maurizio.
So it's the right time for the greetings. I want to join to all the thanks in my name and in the name of Francesco Mancini and all the students of the cognitive therapy school. I had very high expectations, which have been really exceeded, and all satisfied and even more. And I hope we will be able to propose another meeting on the topics, and Francesco might think about that. Francesco, don't think about that immediately. Take your time. Thanks to everybody.